Join EWTN on this special on-location presentation as the Catholic University of America and the Napa Institute present Human Ecology, integrating business and 125 years of Catholic social doctrine.
Thank you, Father, and thank you to everyone here. It's been a stimulating day already. It's a joy for me to represent the School of Theology and also to serve as co-chair for this meeting. I've learned a lot from everybody involved, and it's a special privilege to moderate this panel on Rerum Novarum with a very esteemed group. I think maybe we'll go in spatial order here, so you're free to begin.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to discuss really three topics in the brief time I have here. The first is really to look at the business environment back in 1891 when this encyclical was published, then understand really why did the church have to respond to this, and then finally to really see the witness, to witness really what can be done when the church teaches. I mean, a lot of good things came out of this, and we should be very happy about that. Well, before the late 1800s, of course, we were basically an agrarian society around family farms, family businesses, not really much for the church to get nervous about or publish a lot about. But then, boom, the world changed almost overnight. Mass production machines manufactured, incredible scale, and of course, this basically reduced the need for people. For instance, a person with a simple machine could make about 3,000 cigarettes a day. After this massive machine came in, the cigarette-making machine, that number went to 120,000. So orders of magnitude difference in terms of productivity. You need a lot of matches to light all those cigarettes, and in a typical matchmaking factory, there's about 500 people that could make matches. After you mechanize it with these new machines, that went down to 75. So again, a radical change in productivity. It wasn't just machines, but also marketing radically changed and scaled up. Mass marketing techniques back then were different, of course, but they created vast new markets. Cigarettes, consumption of cigarettes went up by a factor of 5 in just 5 years. Cereal meant animal food back then, but Quaker Oats decided, no, it really needs to mean something else, and they spent heavily, and then finally cereal meant what it means today, something that we have for breakfast. New titans of industry came in and really began to create monopolies to regulate their markets via their own interests, of course. J.P. Morgan in finance, Andrew Carnegie in steel, and John Rockefeller in oil. Charles Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859. And the titans of industry decided that, hey, this worked for animals. Let's just sort of call this social Darwinism or survival for the fittest, but of people, not of just animals. And what this meant was that people had to work long hours. Men worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That wasn't enough really to support the family. So then their wives had to come in and work at half their salaries, and their kids also spending 14 hours a day in the factories. Well, the church simply had to comment because things were moving so fast, and as we've heard from other speakers, the threat really of serious social disruption and new systems were really substantial. Workers resented the conditions, pushed for unions. The church has endorsed unions, of course, right from the beginning of its social doctrine history, but many of those functions didn't work, and so there was a gradual change towards interest in things like socialism. And so there just had to be a response to all of this from the church. So I'll only comment on a few impacts of Rerum Novarum as it pertained to business itself. Certainly, it reiterated the positive role of labor unions. I think that's something that we in business have to continue to keep in mind. Strong endorsement of the right to private property and a strong condemnation of socialism. Also a strong condemnation of business leaders who are pushing this concept of social Darwinism. It just violated every single basic function or breadback foundation of Catholic social doctrine. And then this idea of really pushing for an ownership stake was something that was very unique that the Pope had talked about because he understood people would work harder and have less resentment. And then finally, this basic point that we're still struggling with, that it's immoral to use human beings as instruments for anything, but particularly for making money. Well, business has come a long way since 1891, mostly for the better, of course. Knowingly or unknowingly, executives have embraced many, and societies have embraced many of these theories. So child labor laws, wages and benefits, Sherman antitrust, 40-hour work weeks, all of these things really came from this. And so we should be encouraged and really embrace this task of extending this social doctrine now in our society.
So the task was to say something intelligent in 5 minutes. So here we go. For the bishops, what I do, the space I tend to occupy in justice, peace, and human development, it's a policy space, and it's a policy space around a whole set of issues, but one of the areas is around the issues of poverty reduction and integral human development. So I want to frame my comments on Rerum Novarum, its applicability today in that poverty space, and make some comments on business. It's worth noting, probably obvious to all of us, that the current political dialogue over poverty reduction is insufficient to actually address the problems. Simply reducing our current conversation to how much the state should do and how much the market should do is a very blunt instrument for actually analyzing what is going on in a lot of our communities, particularly in the United States. What causes poverty, where it comes from, has become strikingly complex, and even social science tends to chase it around a little bit and not quite be able to nail it down, partly because of a faulty anthropology, but for other reasons as well. So it's an extremely complex space. This is where Rerum Novarum and Catholic social teaching helps us, because it doesn't let us think simplistically about things. Two things I'd say Rerum Novarum contributes, and I want to thank Catherine earlier for covering these so I gain back 30 seconds of my 5 minutes. All Catholic social teaching, our questions about what we do about poverty and other social questions start with our understanding of the human person. What is a human being? If we don't get this right, nothing else will flow from that. For example, in Rerum Novarum, the argument for a living wage comes from what a human being is and the right to get married. And if you have a right to get married, you have a right to raise kids. And if you have a right to get married and raise kids, you have a right to make a living wage. It all comes from what a human being is by design of God. But I want to go to her second definition of human ecology that she takes from Rerum Novarum, the interconnectedness one, in which what we see is that human beings don't simply participate in the social order as individuals, nor do they participate in it simply in simple relationships just to an institution here or there, whether it be the state, whether it be business, whether it be labor or capital. But there's actually a tremendous complexity here. And here's where I think we've got a fundamental development in Catholic social teaching that's very helpful. In Rerum Novarum, when it came time to offer some solutions, Leo thought fundamentally in terms of institutions, primarily in terms of what's the state's job, what's business's job, what's families' freedoms and sort of responsibility, what's labor's job, what's, and what's the church's job, a far bit of it. And so the way that we're sort of thinking about the human ecology is largely in a set of institutions in relationships needing to navigate, do their particular role, states stay out of the family's business unless they really need you, et cetera, but these institutions sort of doing different things. What's changed, and largely to John Paul II and the sort of turn to anthropology and the question of what a human being is, one of the things that's developed and comes to fruition, I think, in Benedict and has been a theme of Francis, is that we begin to understand human ecology as not just institutional relationships, but engaging what we might more fully call the fullness of human culture. That we understand what it is to be human beings together in a more organic fashion and a strikingly more complex one. So that it's not just what this institution ought to do or that institution should do that speaks to poverty and questions of poverty, but our ideas, our cultural symbols, our religious convictions, our interpersonal relationships, our relationships to civil society. It becomes a much more complex reality. And where this is all leading to, here my punchline is, for business to do what it can do in reducing poverty, beyond doing things like forming benefit corporations, which are, I know, debated, but what it can do, it needs to realize it's stepping into not just a set of institutional relationships. The conversation is not just what's the state do, what's business do, what's the market do. The conversation is actually what does business do stepping into this organic ecological system, and how can it contribute what it knows to the questions that face us in poverty. And so I conclude with 3 thoughts on that. Number 1, I spend a lot of time in places where there's a lot of poverty, and there is tremendous complexity there. You cannot point to any one thing that causes many of the pockets of poverty in our country. It's just too simplistic. What that means is for business to offer solutions, and I think you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't care about this issue, the first thing necessary is proximity. You need to step into these environments and actually see them. I was a member of Legatus when I ran Catholic Charities. I've spent a lot of money running C3s, which means I beg from business leaders all the time. I got a lot of dear friends. And one thing I will say is the great entrepreneurs are able to step into complex situations, see something and figure them out, but you can't do it unless proximity. This also has the added benefit of creating what Catherine was speaking about earlier, which is friendship or solidarity. You can't help a community if you don't know them. This is where social science is helpful, but it doesn't go far enough. If we simply study a social place under a scientific rubric, but we don't actually know human beings in a community, we will not be able to help. So the first thing business needs to do is not just stick with business, but actually bring business and get to know communities. Second thing I would encourage business to do is to start conversations outside of just the business world. The solutions to some of our deepest social problems require business talking to law, law talking to politics, politics talking to community leaders talking to religious leaders talking to people who live on the corner store or whatever. And we need to create a space for that. And I just want to mention that in next summer, all the bishops of the United States are calling a meeting of 3,000 leaders, Catholic leaders from around the country, to come together to talk about both the state of the church and the future of our culture. And business leaders need to be at that table. And I hope some of you in this room are there. Because the conversation cannot reside in one siloed area, as complex as those can be. And my final comment is simply this. We need projects. We need concrete projects where business cooperates with local healthcare, cooperates with anchor institutions, cooperates with community organizations, cooperates with policymakers, cooperates with the local bank, cooperates with the people who run the corner store. We need those kinds of projects if in a lot of the cities I visit and the places I go, we can actually prove that there's something that can be done. Because there's no one single bullet that's going to solve some of the social challenges that we face in these places. And I conclude with this hopeful note. I have been in some of the most challenged places economically in the US, and they're one of the few places in the US where the red-blue divide doesn't govern the conversation. That the problems are so deep and the needs so great that you've got, the red-blue thing doesn't drive the conversation. You're not talking about whether it's the state or the market. What you're talking about is how do we bring all the stakeholders together to solve problems. I think this is the way forward to us, and it's a real gift of Catholic social teaching. Thank you.
Thanks. I thought I would make some observations about some thoughts that came to me as I was rereading Rerum Novarum, and my sense of the difference of our moment to the moment that Leo XIII was writing into in the late 19th century. He was writing during a period of social transformation driven by the dynamism of capitalism, created many new opportunities, but also created many new vulnerabilities. And in that context, many people were tempted to think that a new kind of collectivism would solve the problems that afflicted society. And so what Leo was writing against was an exaggerated, what I would call an exaggerated collectivism, or the danger of an exaggerated collectivism, socialism being the form it took in that era. And it's in that context that he emphasizes the importance of private property to provide a basis for human beings to pursue their own projects in freedom. And he recommended not an individualism, but instead more humane forms of solidarity, more humane forms of collective action. The family, first and foremost, and then civic associations that were where people freely associate in order to meet and address the problems that they face together in their communities. So from which the Catholic principle of subsidiarity comes. So it seems to me that today we are not faced by the temptation of an exaggerated collectivism, but instead we face the temptation of an exaggerated individualism. And that in spite of Bernie Sanders, I don't think that socialism represents, is not a threat. On the other hand, the family is an institution under a great deal of threat. And so where Leo could point to the family as the natural basis upon which to build, I don't believe we can presume that the family exists as a healthy institution in the communities that are under the most stress in our current situation. Nor civic associations. Unfortunately, the ability of communities to sustain civic organizations is declining, especially among poorer Americans. Charles Murray's shown quite clearly that poorer Americans are living in communities with less and less in them, less and less institutional structures in them, other than the naked individual. And we know that marriage is in decline, especially among people who are less successful in our society. And so it seems to me that this problem of apathy, atomization, and lack of workforce participation, and these sorts of things stem from what I would call an exaggerated individualism rather than an exaggerated collectivism. And I think that doesn't mean that the principles in Rerum Novarum that are established, the importance of human dignity and freedom, the important role of the family, the important role of civic associations, they remain, I think, supremely valid. But our approach to them probably needs to be thought through on a different footing. If our besetting problem is an exaggerated individualism, then we need to try to figure out ways to buttress the family, encourage civic associations in poorer communities. And in that case, we may have to use the power of the state in order to provide some support for the family. Policies that many people have proposed, and left and right, different models for how to support the family. But that seems to be something we probably need to consider in our time, as well as civic associations, the faith-based initiatives which the Bush administration started and the Obama administration continued, could be something that we need to emphasize even more. So that was my impression when I reread the encyclical, is that we live in a dissolving era, not a collectivizing era, and that we live in a time of the sovereign individual and not the Leviathan state. And that, not to say that the state doesn't do all kinds of stupid things, and we have lots of bad policies out there that could be, we need to change, but that our greatest danger is not that our fellow citizens are going to get swallowed up by the all-powerful state, but instead that our fellow citizens are going to be atomized and isolated and lead and have trouble leading dignified lives because of their isolation and atomization.
The first thought that comes to mind is that there's a very significant connection between Pope Leo XIII and this university. Of course, it was Pope Leo that signed the charter in 1887 that created the Catholic University of America. And then later, 4 years later, when Rerum Novarum was issued, it took a couple of years for the Catholic University of America to react with the creation of the Department of Economics in 1895. And that department was created in response to this encyclical. And of course, now 125 years or so later, the now department, which has now become the School of Business and Economics, is holding conferences like this where we're discussing some of the impact of this work. As been pointed out by my colleagues up here and the presenters before, there's a couple of themes, central themes to Rerum Novarum. The first was this whole idea that there's a reciprocal nature to labor and capital. That is, to the employer and the employee. You can't have one without the other, and they have to work together effectively or you have nothing. And Pope Leo was very creative in the way he approached this, and this was a groundbreaking idea at that time. And the good news is in today's culture, I think everybody understands this reciprocal nature. And in terms of the way we treat employees and how we minister to them, how we have done away, in most part in this Western culture anyway, with child labor issues, that we've been able to make it appropriate for folks that have disabilities to find employment. There's been a lot of progress in that area, and a lot of, and this all comes back right to Rerum Novarum. Another thing that was a theme in Rerum Novarum was this idea that personal property or property ownership is fundamentally a right and necessary for a functioning economy. And I think that this was groundbreaking at the time, and for the most part, the business side of what goes on in America understands that, understands the importance of personal property, property rights. I'm not sure, however, that our educational system, and I'm talking about K through 12, in terms of what we say about freedom and how we can support freedom, I'm not sure that we make a very good case for personal property ownership in not only in the United States, but around the world. And I think if we don't make a good case for the children that grow up in this culture, then we may be in danger of someday having some issues and somehow seeing that slip away. The third major theme of this was the proper role of government. And of course, Pope Leo suggested when the employer and the employee can't make things work out, then it's appropriate for the government to step in, because by gosh, there are rights and obligations that go with those rights. And I think for the most part, there have been plenty of, our government in the United States has jumped in to assist those things. But I guess there would be some of us who would say, well, maybe in some cases they've stepped in a little bit too far, but we often have to say that legislative and regulatory solutions aren't always the best solution and are always great approximations to what really should be done. And I was very pleased to hear the, Robert and Catherine talking about virtue and the importance of virtue in this whole thing, and how the roots of virtue can be traced back to Pope Leo XIII, and how that virtue, virtuous behavior is very important in making sure that there is that connection. And of course, it does, although subsidiarity was not included in the document, the idea of subsidiarity was first kind of outlined, and of course it was later developed more fully. And subsidiary, of course, is a very important document, and unfortunately, that's something else that is not understood very well in America today. And that Catholic idea of subsidiarity is something that we need to do more work on in terms of explaining and promoting.
Thank you. I might just take moderator's privilege just for a second. I was pretty fascinated by the theme in Bill's, your discussion of the Darwinian influence and the survival of the fittest. These massive social transformations moving from agriculture to industrialization, and Rusty's remark about Leo's target being a false collectivism, and our problem being a false individualism. It seems to me that both of those things are still at work, and were at work then. The Darwinianism is a kind of false individualism within a collectivism, and the crucial thing that Leo identifies here within the socialist mistake, or the false collectivist mistake, is that it inverts the order of nature, as Catherine was talking about. It inverts the order of nature and is so unjust that it makes people unhappy, and it makes it difficult for people to live the virtues. And so a false collectivism as well as a false individualism makes it difficult for people to live the happy life. And I think this is something that's permanent about Leo's wisdom here, is that both of these false collectivisms and false individualisms push against the grain of nature, and they lead to unhappiness, and that unhappiness actually leads to disordered activity. In paragraph 20, Leo talks about the rights and duties of employer-employee relationships, and I think it's important to put that on the table before we begin a discussion. He talks about the right and duty of an employer to see the worker has time for religious obligation, that the worker has time for his or her family. Talk about paternity leave, maternity leave, that the worker has been guarded from corruption and vice and danger. Not something you always hear about except for in compliance law, that you be guarded from vice, that he not neglect his family by squandering his earnings, that the worker never be overburdened, and that the worker be paid his due. And that last line that Leo gives in 20 is the category of justice. That really this is about justice, and justice is the virtue which orders all things well to the happy life. Please thank our panel.
Very nice to see all of you again. Let me begin with a John Paul II story, surprisingly. This must have been in the late 1990s, and the Pope got word that a distinguished Polish actor named Jerzy Stor was in Rome. So we invited Mr. Stor to dinner. Mr. Stor comes up. Pope says his usual rapid-fire Latin grace, sits his guest down across from him, and says, "So, Pan Jerzy, what brings you to Rome?" Mr. Stor says, "Your Holiness, I'm playing in Forefathers' Eve," which from the totally blank looks on all your faces suggests that none of you are Slavic literature majors. Forefathers' Eve is the most famous play in the history of the Polish theater. It's such a powerful evocation of Polish national consciousness that its public performance was banned in partition Poland from 1795 to 1918. Anyway, Pope hears Forefathers' Eve, says, "Oh, Forefathers' Eve, Adam Mickiewicz," talks about how important the play was in the history of Poland, recites large chunks of the play by memory, since he had played in it as a young man. And then he calms down a bit and turns back to his guest and says, "So, Pan Jerzy, what role do you take?" One old actor talking to another. Mr. Stor looks across the dinner table and says, "Your Holiness, I regret to report that I am Satan," who is in fact a character in the play. So the pontifical eyebrow goes up. Pope thinks a minute and then says, "Well, none of us gets to choose our roles, do we?" That's the mood I bring to the podium tonight. My normal congenital mood is Isaiah, but I am feeling a lot more like Jeremiah, and I want to lay out for you via the basic principles of Catholic social doctrine and the extraordinary contributions of St. John Paul II to that, a framework that I hope is helpful for thinking about the very deep trouble we find ourselves in our country at this moment in our history. Catholic social doctrine is built on four foundational principles. Two of those are apparent already in Rerum Novarum, the initial social encyclical Leo XIII of 1891. The first of these is the principle of personalism, or what we might call in a more Anglo-Saxon context, the human rights principle. And it teaches us in soundbite language that everybody is a somebody, and that everybody must be taken seriously as a somebody if politics and economics and culture are going to work the way they should. The second principle, which balances the first, also in Rerum Novarum, is the principle of the common good, or what Anglo-Saxons would call the communitarian principle. It teaches us that, in soundbite terminology, we're all in this together. Pope Pius XI cemented a third principle into the foundations of Catholic social doctrine in 1931 in the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, to mark the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, when he described what he called the principle of subsidiarity, or what we would call in the Anglosphere the principle of civil society, which teaches us that government institutions should be no bigger than necessary. And the principle of solidarity, the fourth principle of the social doctrine, is cemented into the foundations of this great body of thought in 1991 by John Paul II in the encyclical Centesimus Annus. We would call it, in our world of political theory, the principle of civic friendship, and it answers the question, who is my neighbor? The neighbor, and the answer is, my neighbor is everyone whose life I touch. Everyone with whom I am in some form of relationship. The principle of solidarity says to us that neither democracy nor the market can function properly if the only relationship we have with each other is a legal one, if the only thing we know about each other is how to sue each other. That's not a sufficient human foundation for the free society. So, 4 principles: personalism, the common good, subsidiarity and solidarity, the human rights principle. All correct thinking about society begins with the human person, his or her inalienable dignity and value. The communitarian principle, I should exercise my rights so that they advance the good of all, not just my personal good. Subsidiarity, embodied among other things in American federalism, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Multi-tiered levels of authority in a state, and a robust civil society of voluntary associations, families, churches, etc., as the basic schools of freedom. And then solidarity, the principle of civic friendship. If all we know about each other is how we can take each other to court, we've got a problem. John Paul II made numerous original contributions to this foundation, including laying its 4th stone in place, the solidarity principle. In 1981, in his first social encyclical, Laborum Exercens, for the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, he taught us something that is very much, I think, on the minds of this conference and very much part of this notion of human ecology. When many of us were growing up, President Garvey, Father Spitzer, certainly Michael Novak, in catechism class, we were often taught that work is punishment for original sin. Remember that? Adam and Eve don't make a mess, we don't have to work. This did not endear Adam and Eve to those of us then learning the multiplication tables, I assure you. John Paul II said that's not true. That's just not true. Work is, in fact, our participation in God's ongoing creativity in the world. Father Spitzer, I'm sure, remembers that St. Thomas Aquinas once said that if God wanted to end the world, God would not have to do something, God would stop doing something. God's creative relationship to the world does not stop on the seventh day. God's creative relationship to the world, God's creative and sustaining relationship to the world continues through time, and our work is our participation in that, which is why the social doctrine of the church, although using different language over 100 and some years, has always insisted that work cannot be reduced to a simple economic commodity, measurable by a wage alone. That work has a spiritual dimension. Work is an exercise of human freedom. Work is vocational. It's not just career. It's not just subsistence. Work is vocational. And that's a very important lesson for our society today, in a way I'll get back to in a minute. 6 years later, John Paul II issued another social encyclical called Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, in which he spoke for the first time in this almost then 100-year-old tradition of social doctrine of the right of economic initiative, by which he meant that the just state fosters and legally protects entrepreneurship and enterprise. And it does that in a variety of ways, from patent law to copyright law to education that fosters those talents and abilities in young people. And then came, in 1991, for the centenary of Rerum Novarum, the blockbuster, Centesimus Annus. A remarkable encyclical that both looked back over 100 years of Catholic social thought and looked forward into the 21st century and the third millennium. I was saying at a local Catholic school the other night that the more I reflect upon John Paul II, the more he reminds me of Clement Attlee's description of Winston Churchill. I then had to explain to half the people who Clement Attlee was, but that's another story. I will not deign to even suggest that no one here knows who Clement Attlee was. Doesn't know who Clement Attlee was. Clement Attlee once said of Churchill, Winston is like a layer cake. I mean, he's obviously the 20th century, but there's a very obvious 19th century part of him. There's an 18th century part of him, and he said there's a curious 21st century part of him. It was very much true of John Paul II. He was very much a man of his time. He was a modern intellectual with a modern intellectual formation, yet he was deeply rooted in the history of his own country and in the history of philosophical thought in the West, going back several millennia. But he was above all a 21st century guy, even though he only lived 4.5 years into it. And looking forward on this foundation of social doctrine, John Paul II in 1991 said that the free and virtuous society of the 21st century, and those two things always went together for him, freedom and virtue, the free and virtuous society of the 21st century will have three interlocking parts. Who remembers the Ballantine beer label from back in the day? The three rings, you know, right? Okay, it was bad beer, but, you know, we were 18 years old, so. Three interlocking parts: a democratic political community, a free economy, and a vibrant public moral culture. And it was the genius of John Paul II, in my view, to see that it was the third sector, the moral cultural sector, that was the key to all the rest. This man who had never lived in a mature democracy in his life, who never had a bank account in his life, who certainly had no experience of well-functioning markets in his life, nonetheless understood that democracy and the free economy are not machines that can run by themselves. It takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues, owning those virtues and transmitting them to their neighbors and their children, so that democracy and the market produce genuine human flourishing. It takes a critical mass of virtuous people to make the free society work. That meant, at a slightly higher altitude of analysis, that freedom is not simply a faculty of choice, the sacred word of the secular world, choose. Freedom is not simply a faculty of choice that can attach itself to anything. Freedom must be tethered to truth, especially the truth about the human person, and ordered to goodness, to actual behaviors that make for human happiness, if freedom is not to self-destruct. In Centesimus Annus, the Pope also taught, brilliantly, that the free associations of civil society are crucial to both democracy and the market. Democracy and the market can't be reduced to the individual and the mega institutions of governance and economy. There's this mediating middle tier of voluntary associations, which begins, of course, with the family and certainly includes religious associations, which are crucial for the democratic project and crucial for a well-functioning free economy. Why? Because those are what the Pope called the first schools of freedom. I have a 9-month-old granddaughter. She is a beautiful little bundle of willfulness. What she wants now. Every 2-year-old ever born, every 9-month-old ever born, is a beautiful bundle of willfulness and self-absorption. What turns all of those beautiful little bundles of willfulness and self-absorption into citizens who can function in a democratic context by persuading others, not just demanding? What turns them into the kind of people who can be prudent risk takers, who know how to defer gratification for larger ends later on, who know how to be, as so many of you are, thoughtful and generous philanthropists? The state doesn't do that, can't do that. It's a memo to Bernie Sanders. The state can't do that. And a few other people I could mention. State can't do that. That happens in the free associations of civil society, beginning with the family. That's what happens in our Catholic schools. For all of those decades in which our grandparents and great-grandparents were becoming the kind of people who could make this country work, they were being taught to do that in Catholic schools. So the absolute crucial importance of the free associations of civil society to the democratic project. Finally, in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II broke through the crust of what had been a curious materialism in Catholic social doctrine from Leo XIII on, the notion that wealth is stuff. Wealth is either land, wealth is stuff, it's natural resources, it's stuff you make, but wealth is stuff. John Paul II said that's not the way it's going to work in the 21st century. In fact, it's not the way it's working now. Wealth resides first and foremost in the human mind. Wealth is creativity, wealth is entrepreneurship, wealth is creating enterprise, and that means that poverty is exclusion. And it means that the first requisite of justice is to bring excluded people into the circles of production and exchange where their economic creativity can be unleashed. There will be a lot more of that said in the rest of the conference, I'm sure. Now, that's the framework. How well is all of that being received in America today? I advise those of you who are near a wine bottle to fill your glasses. Because Napa, we have a problem. Take the core principles, the 4 core principles That personalist principle, the human rights principle, everybody is a somebody, is in fact not been well received. We see around us wildly distorted individualism, detached from any sense of connection or obligation. We see young people unable to form lasting relationships, to make vocational decisions. I was speaking to a seminary rector the other night, not Monsignor Pankey, I hasten to add. And I said, what's your biggest challenge? He said, getting these guys off the dime and telling them there's a moment when discernment ends and formation begins. He said they've got a generational problem with making a decision. All of you who have children who've been looking for husbands or wives know exactly the problem I'm talking about. That's the function of a distorted individualism. And we have now in Obergefell, the Supreme Court decision last year on so-called gay marriage, the Supreme Court of the United States defining the human person as a twitching bundle of desires that the state has an obligation to facilitate the fulfillment of, no matter what those desires might be. Personalism is not doing too good. What about the common good? Common good is being overrun by the kind of identity politics we see all around us today. The identity politics of people who claim that you have to tick 3 boxes of social, racial, ethnic, gender status for a proper Supreme Court nomination. The identity politics of a Senate candidate near here who said that, the Senate needs the perspective of a single mother raising a child in difficult circumstances today. Well, I'm sure the Senate needs to know about that, but what on earth does that have to do with your qualifications for office? Identity politics has pushed out a notion of the common good, and it has certainly pushed out the notion articulated so magnificently in this city in the summer of 1963 by Dr. Martin Luther King of a colorblind society of people who judged each other on the basis of virtue, not on the basis of complexion or gender or any of that business. The principle of subsidiarity has been taking an enormous beating in the United States, probably since the Woodrow Wilson administration. We are now faced with the very real problem. Those of you in the business world know this as well. President Garvey knows it in his life, of a Leviathan state, which isn't even functioning according to the separation of powers laid out in the Constitution, because there's now a 4th branch of government, except we don't call it that. It's the administrative state, in which loosely written laws are interpreted by administrators who then decide the penalties to impose if you don't agree with their interpretation of the law. This is a fundamental violation of the principle of subsidiarity. We all live with it every day, and it is eroding the foundations of our country. Solidarity, obviously threatened by the new tribalism and the identity politics I talked about before. A mere 15 years after we saw really extraordinary expressions of solidarity, the virtue, on 9/11, when people who had no idea who they were trying to save put their lives at risk simply because they felt a sense of human obligation that was not legal, that was moral. 15 years after that, we see the kind of nonsense that has been going on at various campaign rallies as the vulgarization of our politics now takes a decidedly ugly, violent form. So none of the core principles of Catholic social doctrine seem to have been well taught or well received. What about those contributions of John Paul II? Maybe they're doing a little better. Well, not really. There's a lot of entrepreneurial juice in this country still, but to hear people talk over the last 9 months, whether it's those who have been left behind by globalization, for which we must feel some sense of responsibility and begin to think very hard about how to assist into becoming the economically creative people they ought to be. But in any of these worlds, you don't hear much of a sense of work as vocation. Bottom line-ism of a very crude and vulgar sort is the order of the day in too many parts of our economic life, and we need to recover a sense of work as vocation if this enormous transition through which we're going in the world economy, which is, to state the obvious, as consequential as the transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, is going to be traversed with the human ecology still intact. What about the public moral culture that John Paul II said was so crucial to the proper functioning of democracy in the market? Well, that has eroded to the point where a candidate for President of the United States can boast of the size of what St. Paul used to call his less honorable parts, and the response is either laughter or a yawn. That's not good. That's not good. There's a great deterioration of an understanding of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. First time I had lunch with President Garvey after he came to town, I asked him what he was doing that night. He says, I'm going over to one of the men's dorms to talk about manliness. That's why he's a great university president. But this is a real problem. This is a real problem. The sexual revolution has created a level of vulgarity and a level of confusion that is deeply wounding our young people and making the future of public moral culture ever more tenuous. Too much of higher education in this country thinks of democracy and the market as self-running machines and then wonders why when they don't run well. Doesn't attend to the necessity of that critical mass of virtue to make these brilliantly designed machines work well, and then wonders why they don't run well. As for freedom, that to which the founders pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, how often, how too often, is that reduced to a kind of slogan from the great moral philosopher Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. Okay, that's a problem. That's a problem. And then civil society, those schools of freedom, so crucial to democracy and the market, are under unprecedented assault, the institutions of civil society, over the past 7 years. One of the hallmarks of the present administration is a consistent, unnecessary, willful, and I would say mean-spirited assault on the freedom of civil societal institutions, of which the Little Sisters of the Poor is the most obvious and grotesque example. We are going to know by this summer, irrespective of whose convention is going to do what at the end of July, we are going to know whether religious institutions in our country are going to have the legal capacity to be themselves as they understand themselves. That's in question for the first time ever in our history. This is serious business. This is very, very serious business. Finally, while it's certainly true, it seems to me, that some of the welfare reform of 20 years ago has been successful and has provided the means by which people have been helped and have helped themselves to deal with persistent multi-generational poverty. The fact is that multi-generational poverty continues to grow in our country and now is a major problem outside our inner urban areas, but in fact throughout the country. If we want to understand why we all feel nervous right now, why there's this deep sense of distress among thoughtful people who don't want to just be angry, who don't want to just rail at establishments and elites, but who feel, correctly in my view, something is seriously awry here. We want to begin to probe why that's the case, why that's a proper intuition about our circumstance. I think we need look no farther than the things we're talking about in these several days. This magnificent body of thought, Catholic social doctrine, has not been taught as well as it should, has not been translated into terms that make sense to our fellow Americans of other religious convictions or no religious convictions, has not been, to use the technical theological term, received as it should have been, and the country is worse off for that. The country is worse off for that, and we are now, for the first time in a very long time, in real peril of seeing the institutions of faith lived in full that have been built in this country over more than 200 years, supported by generous philanthropy from dimes to tens of millions of dollars, destroyed because the social doctrine has not been taught as it should have been, has not been received as it should have been, has not been translated as it ought to have been for others, which is precisely why this new initiative at Catholic University is so important, because it is committed to doing precisely that for the future. Problem is, the clock is running. The clock is running. Every one of us here needs to know that whoever the president is, as of next January 20th, these cultural currents have achieved a virtual tsunami-like force, and we're not too good at figuring out how to respond to those. And hopefully this conference will help us do that. But the immediate challenge for everyone in this room and for Catholic leaders around the United States, clerical, lay, religious, is to own this wonderful tradition we have. We have the tools. The tools, the intellectual tools have been given us. We own that, figure out how to apply those in revitalizing the human ecology that makes democracy and prosperity possible, then we can indeed give this country a new birth of freedom in gratitude for the labors and sacrifices of all of those who have gone before us. Thank you.